Known for his harsh and militaristic approach, Hideki Tojo was a Japanese officer and politician who served as Prime Minister of Japan during World War II. He had a significant role in the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. In addition, Tojo was in charge of some of the bloodiest crimes committed throughout the conflict, such as the Nanking, China, assault and the Bataan Death March. In 1884, Hideki Tojo was born in Tokyo. His father was a general in the Japanese army, therefore he was raised in a military household. Tojo enlisted in the army at an early age, following in his father's footsteps. He advanced through the ranks swiftly, becoming a general in his early 40s. Tojo became the Minister of War in 1940. He was a fervent supporter of going to war with the United States and was instrumental in the attack on Pearl Harbor preparations. Tojo was appointed Japan's Prime Minister following the incident. He managed the Japanese war effort in this capacity for the following 3 years. Tojo was an oppressive and brutal leader. He was prepared to sacrifice millions of lives in order to accomplish his goal of winning the war. In addition, he was accountable for some of the worst crimes committed throughout the conflict, such as the Nanking Rape and the Bataan Death March. Japan submitted to the Allied forces in 1945. For war crimes, Tojo was detained and put on trial. After a conviction, he received the death penalty. A controversial figure in Japanese history is Hideki Tojo. Some believe he ought to be held accountable for his acts as a war criminal. Some saw him as a patriot who was only attempting to act in the best interests of his nation. Whatever one's feelings on Tojo, he was unquestionably a significant character in Japanese history. He was a complicated and contradictory person, and there is still disagreement about his legacy. Imagine a man with sharp eyes and a commanding attitude, giving orders that would send millions of people to fight. A man known as the Razor because of his cunning and brutality. Not just any warlord, though. He is Hideki Tojo, the Japanese wartime Prime Minister who set the Pacific theater of World War II in motion. Was he just a ruthless Banzai warlord, though? Now let's explore further. Tojo was born into a military-oriented family. Thus, his future appeared inevitable. He did well in the strict Imperial Military Academy, moving up the ranks through sheer willpower and steadfast devotion. But ambition was what kept him going. He was a power-hungry man, not only in the military, but also in the corridors of power. As the driving force behind Japan's expansionist policy, Tojo promoted military superiority throughout Asia. With skillful maneuvering between political factions, he made his way to the post of war minister. He planned the historic attack on Pearl Harbor from this position, enveloping the entire world in a bloody war. There was more to Tojo's leadership than just violence. He was an industrious worker, a careful planner, and a crafty tactician. He used an iron fist to silence any dissent and demanded complete compliance. However, his brutality did not stop at the battlefield. Atrocities like the Bataan Death March and the Nanking Rape occurred under his watch, permanently tarnishing his reputation. Tojo held onto power as the war turned against Japan, consolidating his hold in spite of growing casualties. But his aspirations of imperial glory were dashed in 1944 when he was compelled to retire. He was found guilty of war crimes and given the death penalty when Japan submitted to the war. His attempted suicide attempt, his last deed, only served to deepen the mystery around him. Tojo is still a contentious figure. Though his actions during the conflict are condemnable, a more nuanced picture is painted when one considers his intricacies and intentions. He was a product of his era, driven by nationalistic fervor and molded by a martial upbringing. Was he an insensitive monster, or a man who really thought what he was doing was for the good of his country? Perhaps the solution is in the middle. Japan's prime minister throughout the war, Hideki Tojo, was more than just a Banzai warlord giving commands. Being a product of his era, he was a complicated and divisive personality who had far-reaching effects after lighting the Pacific region of World War II. To truly comprehend him, one must look beyond simple classifications. He was a standout student at the strict Imperial Military Academy, moving up the ranks with steadfast devotion and a keen mind, and gaining the moniker Razor. However, his true desire was power, power that did not come from fighting. Through cunning maneuvering around political rivals, he became the war minister and became extremely powerful. Tojo came to stand for Japan's assertive foreign policy as a result of his expansionist aspirations and strong sense of nationalism. He was the mastermind behind the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, which started a global war. Although his ability to think strategically and plan carefully is undeniable, his cruelty left a lasting impression. Tojo was a dictator who demanded total submission in addition to being a leader during a battle. His name was permanently tarnished when dissent was suppressed, and crimes like the Bataan Death March and the Nanking Rape occurred under his supervision. Tojo held on to power as the war turned against Japan, his aspirations of imperial glory dwindling. In 1944, he was forced to resign and was put on trial for war crimes. His failed suicide attempt added a further level of mystery to his persona. Was he a heartless monster, or a man who thought what he was doing was right for his country? The solution is in the middle. He was a product of the nationalism and militarism that molded his childhood. Although his actions were despicable, a more nuanced picture is painted when one considers the complexity of his intentions. Hideki Tojo is still a contentious character who serves as a warning about unbridled ambition and the terrible effects of war. We discover not only the guy himself, but also the factors that shaped him and the perils of accepting nationalism and militarism without question by peeling back the layers of his life and decisions. To fully understand the ascent and decline of Hideki Tojo, we must examine the turbulent historical background of Japan in his time. This setting reveals a country struggling with multifaceted influences, going beyond the conventional Banzai warlord description. Japan quickly modernized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by a potent combination of nationalism, pride in the legacy of the samurai, and a desire to become one of the world's superpowers. There was a strong belief in Japan's uniqueness and its right to increase its territory and power because of the Meiji Restoration. Tojo, who came from this system, personified these principles. Victories in the Russo-Japanese War, 1804–05, and World War I increased the military's might and bolstered popular confidence in military leadership. The military believed that the way to address the issue of blurring the boundaries between national security and imperial ambition was to expand into resource-rich regions such as Southeast Asia and Manchuria. The US and other Western colonial interests in Asia were at odds with Japan's aggressive expansionist actions. Sanctions and embargoes enforced by the US fueled anti-Western sentiment in Japan. When negotiations over China and resource access broke down, Japan was forced to consider a military solution. As a fervent supporter of rapid growth, Tojo advanced through the ranks and was appointed war minister in 1940. With adroit maneuvering of political groups and public opinion manipulation, he was able to obtain the emperor's consent for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The Pacific theater of World War II was launched with this attack, which was designed to weaken US Pacific forces and seize resources. Japan's early military victories stoked patriotic enthusiasm and enhanced Tojo's reputation as a capable leader. However, his cruelty, which was on display in crimes like the Nanking Rape and the Bataan Death March, permanently damaged his reputation. Japan's expansion halted because it underestimated the industrial prowess and resilience of the US. Growing losses and obstacles revealed Tojo's strategy's weaknesses. His popularity declined, and in 1944 he was compelled to step down. Both the war and Tojo's rule came to an end with Japan's surrender in 1945. In 1948, after being found guilty of war crimes, he was put to death. His legacy is still debatable and complicated. Tojo was more than just a one-dimensional antagonist. He represented and was a product of a certain period and location in Japanese history. A thorough examination of the historical background, including the emergence of nationalism, militarism, concerns about national security and economic hardships, and the complicated diplomatic environment, is necessary to comprehend his intentions and actions. He acts as a warning about the perils of unbridled ambition, the terrible results of war, and the significance of comprehending the complexity of history. To truly comprehend Japan's wartime Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, one must look behind the moniker Banzai Warlord and investigate his early life and military career. This voyage reveals not just a man, but also a product of his surroundings, molded by aspiration, tradition, and the nation's growing zeal for militarism. He was raised with a strict sense of discipline, devotion, and obedience by his general father. The Imperial Military Academy, renowned for its rigorous training and focus on self-sacrifice, was a place where the young Tojo thrived. He flourished in this setting, placing 10th in his class and being known as Razor for his cunning and ruthlessness. Tojo was commissioned in 1902 as a second lieutenant and advanced through the ranks steadily. Having fought in the Russo-Japanese War 1904-05, he saw firsthand the military's rise to prominence and authority. His conviction in expansionism and the military's essential role in pursuing it were strengthened by this experience. Tojo was stationed in Germany as a military attaché from 1919 to 1922. His thinking was shaped by this encounter with Western techniques and ideals. His admiration for German discipline and efficiency strengthened his conviction that decisive action and strong leadership were essential. After coming back to Japan, Tojo made a name for himself as a rigorous disciplinarian and proficient administrator. Under his direction, the Elite 1st Infantry Regiment was put down in 1936 with remarkable brutality. His devotion to the military institution and his unshakable support for it were demonstrated in this episode. Tojo was named Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army in 1937. Manchuria had been under Japanese occupation since 1931. His reputation as a strong supporter of aggressive expansion was further cemented when he played a pivotal role in stifling local resistance and extending Japanese power. After being elevated to the office of Vice Minister of War in 1938, Tojo took center stage in Japan's military strategy making. As a result of his strong support for the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, he brought Japan closer to war by uniting it with the Axis nations. When Tojo was named Minister of War in 1940, he rose to great authority. Through skillful manipulation of political divisions, he was able to quell resistance and strengthen his hold on the military. Thanks in large part to his influence, the Emperor authorized the attack on Pearl Harbor, which sent Japan into World War II. By 1941, Hideki Tojo, who had been exposed to Western ideals, his rigorous military training, and his samurai background, had become a formidable figure. His steadfast commitment to expansionism, along with his cunning and ambition, made him a key figure in Japan's march towards war. This examination of Tojo's upbringing and military career provides an essential missing piece to the puzzle of comprehending his influence on Japan's course throughout the war. Getting to know Japan's controversial wartime Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, requires going beyond the easy Banzai warlord moniker. Examining his upbringing and family history is essential to understanding his legacy, because these factors molded his values, beliefs, and aspirations. Tojo, who was born in 1884, came from a long family of samurai. The distinguished General Hidenori, his father, taught his son to be obedient to authority, disciplined, and loyal. Tojo's upbringing was based on the principles of Bushido, the samurai code that emphasizes honor, devotion, and self-sacrifice. These principles translated into a conviction in selflessness for the benefit of the country as a whole and an unflinching respect for military hierarchy. Encircled by military personnel, Tojo's fate appeared to be set in stone. His grandfather was a samurai who participated in the Boshin War and helped to shape modernization with the Meiji Restoration. The idea that serving in the military is a family heritage and a means of achieving both personal dignity and national glory was further reinforced by the fact that his brothers and uncles were all in the military. The Tojo household had a strict and orderly life. Hard effort, obedience, and emotional control were emphasized. Hideki was taught at a young age to control his emotions and put responsibility first. This emotional inflexibility that verged on stoicism became a defining characteristic of his character and showed through in his leadership and decision-making. The state religion, Shintoism, was a major influence on Tojo's upbringing. The emperor was adored as a living god who required complete submission and allegiance. Tojo considered the emperor as the personification of Japan's glory and future, and this gave rise to a strong feeling of nationalism and steadfast loyalty to him. Tojo's generation saw Japan rapidly modernize despite being deeply rooted in tradition. This gave him a feeling of aspiration and reinforced his conviction that Japan should play a significant role in international affairs. He held the view that attaining this objective required both expansionism and military might. This view was influenced by both tradition and the goals of a modernizing country. Tragedies have their part in Tojo's personal life. His younger brother committed suicide while serving in the military, and his mother passed away young. Thus he was raised to be stoic and determined to carry out his perceived duty while suffering personal tragedy. It's crucial to refrain from generalizing about Tojo's upbringing. His personality and choices were influenced by a complicated network of factors, including historical events, education, and encounters with other personalities, even if tradition and family history had a considerable impact. Understanding Tojo's family history and upbringing can help one better understand his motives, morals, and decision-making processes. It shows a man molded by duty, dedication, and an unyielding faith in Japan's uniqueness. Understanding his background allows us to present a more nuanced portrait of this complicated and divisive individual, even though we do not support his actions. His adventure started when he was accepted into the exclusive Imperial Military Academy, an event that had a profound impact on how he developed into the driven and cunning commander he became. Analyzing this crucial phase illuminates the factors that shaped him and drove him along his contentious route. Tojo, who was born in 1884, came from a long family of samurai. His father was a decorated general who taught him the importance of discipline, loyalty, and selflessness in the samurai code of Bushido, and ingrained in him an unflinching reverence for military service. In 1901, he enrolled in the academy not just as a professional decision, but also as a way to honor his family's legacy and perform his civic duty. The academy was infamously unforgiving. Its strict training program was designed to create submissive, unselfish officers who could command soldiers in any situation. Drastic physical drills, tactical maneuvers, and ideological indoctrination occupied the days. Cadets' strong sense of camaraderie and competitive spirit were cultivated by the Spartan living conditions and focus on conformity and unconditional obedience. Tojo flourished in this setting. Because of his cunning, sharp mind and persistent commitment, he was known as Razor for his brutality and discipline. His scholastic prowess was especially evident in his study of military history and tactics, where he honed the exacting planning skills that would later characterize his leadership. The academy ingrained the Bushido ideals, in addition to academic knowledge. Above all, there was honor, bravery, and unwavering devotion to the emperor. The severe penalties meted out for acts of disobedience served as additional reinforcement of how crucial complete compliance was. Tojo was shaped by this inflexible system to become a leader who expected his subordinates to exhibit the same selflessness and discipline, often with deadly results. The academy offered more than simply intellectual and physical challenges. It promoted a distinct social structure according to academic standing and admission year. As a member of the 21st class, Tojo was in a higher class than the younger cadets. This fostered a culture of seniority and rigid class dynamics that influenced his eventual military career, but it also gave him a sense of leadership and responsibility. A strong feeling of nationalism and Japan's supposed proper place in the world were also forcefully ingrained by the academy. Geopolitical and historical lectures focused on Japan's desire for expansionism and the threat posed by Western countries. This strengthened Tojo's conviction that Japan is unusual and that the military is essential to the country's success. Tojo entered the officer corps formally in 1905, having graduated 10th in his class. As a result of his intense training, which honed his body, intellect and philosophy, he went from being a young samurai to a formidable person prepared to dedicate himself to the emperor and Japan's military aspirations, known as the Razor. There was more to Tojo's admission to the academy than just learning military skills. It was a life-changing event that cemented in him fundamental principles, convictions, and goals that shaped his approach to leadership, his capacity for strategic thought, and, in the end, his part in pushing Japan toward war. Although the academy had a big impact, Tojo's character and decisions were also shaped by a lot of other things that happened outside of it. More investigation into his personal experiences, family history, and historical setting may paint a fuller picture of the man and the choices that shaped his life. Analyzing Tojo's academy experience provides important insights into his leadership style, goals, and inner workings. It reveals the beginnings of a man whose unshakable nationalism, strict discipline, and unflinching faith in Japan's military destiny formed him. Understanding his origins helps us comprehend this complicated and contentious man in a more nuanced way, even while it does not excuse his decisions. The Japanese military saw Hideki Tojo climb through the ranks thanks to a combination of ambition, ruthlessness, and political astuteness. Tojo was raised with a strong feeling of duty and allegiance to the emperor after being born into a samurai family in 1884. He was a standout student at the Imperial Military Academy, graduating in 1905 and moving up the ranks swiftly. His service in multiple foreign conflicts, such as World War I and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, shaped Tojo's early career and sharpened his military abilities, while exposing him to the military's rising influence and stature in Japanese society. Tojo was more and more involved in politics in the 1920s and 1930s, supporting the militaristic and nationalistic elements of the Japanese government. He was a major player in the preparation and conduct of the 1931 Manchurian incident, in which Japan invaded and occupied Manchuria. Tojo's status as a rising military star and hardliner was further cemented by this aggressive behavior. Tojo had grown to be one of the most influential people in Japan by the late 1930s. As Prime Minister from 1941 to 1944, Tojo oversaw the Japanese Empire's early development during the war. Appointed Minister of War in 1940, he was instrumental in the decision to attack Pearl Harbor in 1941, drawing the United States into World War II. But his leadership was also characterized by a string of miscalculations and escalating discontent in the armed forces. In 1944, Tojo was compelled to step down as Japan's chances of winning the war started to dwindle. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East tried and found Tojo guilty of war crimes after the war. A variety of things contributed to Tojo's ascent through the ranks of the Japanese military: his own ambition, the nation's increasing militarization, and the openings created by several overseas conflicts. His legacy is still debatable. Some consider him as a representation of Japanese aggression, while others see him as a nuanced individual caught up in the social mores of his day. However, his involvement in the Manchurian invasion of 1931 illuminates a pivotal moment in his rise to prominence and provides insight into his expanding power and contentious legacy. Tojo, who was raised in a samurai household, personified the warrior mentality. His expansionist beliefs exactly matched the Manchurian incident, as it is known in Japan. His strong sense of nationalism and conviction in Japan's manifest destiny in Asia were fueled by his view that resource-rich Manchuria was essential to Japan's economic and military might. Tojo had a complicated duty as the Kwantung Army's chief of staff while he was stationed in Manchuria. Although the evidence from history does not prove that he was the only mastermind, he clearly had a great deal of power and aggressively encouraged the junior commanders who launched the invasion. By framing their acts as a reaction to a staged Chinese attack and influencing the emperor's ascent, he assisted in the planning and justification of their actions. In Japan, the Manchurian invasion was first celebrated as a victory, even though it was denounced internationally. With a national reputation and political capital, Tojo was seen as a decisive and effective leader. By using this momentum to build his authority within the armed forces and the government, he was able to pave the path for greater expansionism and, ultimately, Pearl Harbor. He finally rose to the positions of Prime Minister in 1940 and War Minister in 1941. The invasion was more than just a resource war. It was also a demonstration of Japan's military might and capacity to challenge the global order. Seeing its relative success, Tojo probably took it as a sign of more to come, strengthening his faith in Japan's military prowess and the viability of even more audacious conquests. On the other hand, the invasion had disastrous effects. It was a flagrant breach of international law that strained ties with the West and gave other expansionist regimes confidence. It demonstrated Tojo's ruthlessness and propensity to manipulate events for his personal goal, and it formed a lifelong stain on his legacy. Although the Manchurian invasion cemented Tojo's reputation as a formidable leader, his true reasons for doing so were probably a complicated combination of self-interest, nationalistic zeal, and a sincere conviction that Japan needed to grow. We can comprehend Tojo's ambition, political scheming, and the historical background that drove his actions better by looking at his part in the Manchurian invasion. It's critical to keep in mind that his legacy is complex, and that to minimize him to the status of a mere Banzai warlord would be to dismiss the complexity of both the man and the times he lived in. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Japan experienced a swift modernization. A powerful mixture of nationalism, pride in samurai customs, and a desire to enter the ranks of world powers was ingrained throughout this transition, which was spurred by the Meiji Restoration. Their influence was further increased by their victories in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–05, and World War I, which fueled public confidence in military solutions. Born into this context, Tojo reflected these ideals and rose to prominence as a leading proponent of aggressive growth. The military perceived resource-rich regions such as Manchuria and Southeast Asia as the answer, obfuscating the distinction between imperial aspirations and national security. Japan's expansionist actions in Asia directly challenged the US in particular. Western-imposed trade restrictions and embargoes stoked anti-Western sentiment in Japan and drove the country toward military action. A significant step toward growth was taken in 1931 with the Manchurian incident, in which Japan attacked and conquered the area. A major actor in the affair, Tojo rose in prominence and garnered political capital, rising to the position of war minister in 1940. Japan joined the Axis countries and moved closer to war under his direction when it signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. Although early victories stoked patriotic fervor, an underestimate of US industrial might and resilience led to Japan's ultimate demise. Tojo planned the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, which launched the United States into the Pacific theater of World War II. Beyond Tojo's direction, Japan's expansionist objectives had disastrous effects. It caused immense misery, war crimes, and the collapse of the world order. But to really comprehend these policies, one must look past oversimplified conceptions of hostility. It necessitates analyzing the intricate interactions between nationalism, foreign rivalry, economic concerns, and strategic planning that influenced Japan's actions. Tojo wasn't the only one who promoted and carried out expansionism, but he was a major contributor. He was a product and a symbol of his day, acting in accordance with deeply held views and within a particular historical setting. A more comprehensive picture of Japan's wartime decisions and their long-term effects may be obtained by analyzing his leadership in the context of the larger factors influencing the country's course. Japan's aggressive expansion across Asia was directed by Hideki Tojo, and the international world found it difficult to respond with unity. Comprehending these reactions illuminates not just the historical responses, but also the intricate network of political agendas and ethical quandaries that emerged during this turbulent time. Early actions by Japan, such as the Manchurian incident in 1931, were received with uncertainty and little response. Protests against the League of Nations proved futile, and Western governments, engrossed in internal affairs and frightened of conflict, frequently turned to appeasement as a means of avoiding direct conflict. Foreign censure increased as Japan's aggression increased, especially after it invaded China in 1937. Japan was kicked out of the League, and the US applied economic penalties. But because these policies were toothless, Japan was able to carry on with its expansion pretty much unhindered. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the US entered the war at last, bringing together previously wary nations like the Soviet Union and Britain in an international alliance against the Axis. This was a turning point that turned a localized fight into a global battle. The Germany First plan was adopted by the Allied coalition, giving the defeat of Nazi Germany in Europe top priority. This resulted in the continuation of crimes like the Bataan Death March and the Nanking Rape by postponing a full-scale onslaught against Japan in the Pacific. The moral ambiguities of giving priority to some conflict zones were brought to light by this delay, which sparked arguments and criticism within the Allies. International indignation over Japan's war crimes intensified as the tide turned against the country. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was established with the intention of prosecuting Japanese officials for their activities during the war. In 1948, Tojo was put on trial and executed along with other senior officers. Along with punishment, there were attempts at healing and restoration following the conflict. The goals of US occupation of Japan were to promote democratic values and demilitarize the country. Even though the Marshall Plan was mostly intended for Europe, Japan was also given assistance, which helped the country's economy recover. The worldwide reaction against Japan's expansionism is still a complicated and nuanced historical episode. It illustrates the difficulties in striking a balance between national security and interests, the dangers of appeasement, and the morally complicated choices that must be made during times of conflict. In the end, it also emphasizes the possibility of cooperation and reconciliation following a fight, as demonstrated by the US-Japan partnership of today. The distinct geopolitical interests, ideological positions, and internal forces of each country influenced its response. Moreover, the reactions changed throughout time as a result of changing alliances and events. As Japan's wartime prime minister from 1941 to 1944, Hideki Tojo was more than simply a Banzai warlord. His term shows that Tojo was a multifaceted leader who ultimately led Japan down a tragic path despite being a figure of strategic brilliance and brutal control. Centralized control and an uncompromising devotion to expansionism were hallmarks of Tojo's leadership. He solidified military authority, putting an end to dissent and requiring total submission. His years in the military had sharpened his strategic intellect, which he used to plan the early war's triumphs. His risk of attacking Pearl Harbor unexpectedly in an attempt to weaken US Pacific forces initially paid off. He carefully thought out his next campaigns, conquering large portions of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. His reputation as a capable leader was cemented in the public perception by these accomplishments. But there was a sinister side to this facade. The cruelty of Tojo's leadership was evident. His disdain for human life was demonstrated by crimes such as the Nanking Rape and the Bataan Death March. In the end, these actions damaged Japan's reputation and turned off possible allies, even while they increased fear and obedience. Tojo's strategic rigidity and underestimate of the Allied determination were exposed as the conflict dragged on. He obstinately stuck to antiquated strategies and refused to change with the times. This resulted in growing losses at Guadalcanal and Midway, which turned the tide of the war. As the battle stretched on and deaths increased, public support for Tojo declined. His position was further undermined by growing criticism within the military, which was dissatisfied with his leadership and strategic errors. When Tojo was forced to step down in 1944, his country was on the verge of defeat. His leadership caused much carnage and ruin, leaving a tainted legacy that is still controversial today. In order to comprehend Tojo, we must refrain from viewing him as a one-dimensional antagonist. He was a product of his period, formed by the militaristic ideals, nationalistic zeal that characterized pre-war Japan, and the customs of the samurai. His leadership was characterized by both deadly weaknesses and strategic brilliance. Analyzing these intricacies provides a more sophisticated comprehension of his influence on Japan's course during the war. Not everything in Hideki Tojo's tenure as Japan's Prime Minister, 1941-1944, was shaped by wartime expansionism. He carried out a number of domestic initiatives and reforms that attempted to solve pre-existing social and economic issues, as well as mobilize the country for total war. Control at the central level was essential. By streamlining bureaucracy, Tojo gave himself extensive control over the distribution of resources, industrial output, and labor mobilization. He imposed severe price controls, rationing, and a loyalty-first mentality, which stifled opposition and promoted steadfast support for the war effort. Acknowledging the pivotal function of industry, Tojo oversaw notable growth in vital industries such as steel and shipbuilding. But frequently, quantity was given precedence over quality in these endeavors, which resulted in inefficiencies and logistical snags. Tojo recognized the importance of public support. He presented the war as a heroic fight for the survival of the country, promoting archaic ideals like filial piety and allegiance to the emperor. The propaganda apparatus produced patriotic stories, silencing critics and presenting an optimistic image of victory that was certain. Tojo addressed pre-existing social and economic challenges in spite of the wartime setting. He put in place land reforms to quell unrest in the countryside and boost agricultural productivity. Priorities for the war and a lack of resources hindered his attempts to enhance social welfare programs and working conditions. Tojo's domestic policy had a range of results. His mobilization efforts helped to increase production during the war, but the emphasis on output rather than quality and the contempt for workers' rights created the conditions for future economic difficulties. Social engineering suppressed dissent and individual liberties while promoting national unity. Although his changes gave some groups short-term respite, they eventually proved insufficient to address more fundamental problems. Analyzing his domestic policy reveals a leader who strikes a balance between pre-existing issues and the demands of war. Although he wasn't a warmonger per se, the choices he made as a result of his military mindset and the demands of war permanently changed the social, economic, and political climate of Japan. His unwavering commitment to bolstering the armed forces throughout his life was essential in determining Japan's course, resulting in both expansionist successes and eventual losses. Analyzing his contributions clarifies his goals, strategies, and long-term influence on Japan's armed forces. Born in 1884, Tojo came from a long line of samurai, which gave him a great regard for military customs and ideals. His fierce temperament and quick intelligence earned him the nickname Razor after his stellar performance at the esteemed Imperial Military Academy. These qualities propelled him up the ranks, as did his unshakable conviction that Japan needed a formidable military. Tojo was a proponent of military modernization throughout his tenure. He implemented changes that prioritized automation, air power, and a single command structure while studying Western tactics and doctrines. His emphasis on offensive tactics and disdain for defensive measures contributed significantly to the development of the do-or-die approach, which would ultimately have disastrous effects. From 1940 on, Tojo led a major military build-up in his capacity as war minister. He strengthened the armed forces, increased armament production, and developed the military sector. Japan's early victories in the Second World War were largely due to this expansion, but it also put a strain on resources and revealed logistical weaknesses. Tojo puts total control first. He put an end to military opposition by ordering his troops to obey without question. This brutal strategy increased productivity, but inhibited creativity and flexibility, two vital qualities in a protracted conflict. Tojo recognized the influence of ideology. He engendered among the troops a strong sense of devotion to the emperor and Japan's greatness. This Bushido spirit inspired bravery and selflessness, but it also resulted in crimes and a disdain for human life, which damaged the Japanese military's reputation globally. It is indisputable that Tojo has strengthened the military. Although he made it into a powerful force, his leadership was eventually ineffective. In the end, his emphasis on quantity over quality, rigid tactics, and contempt for the human cost of combat proved to be harmful. In order to comprehend Tojo's function, oversimplified interpretations must be avoided. He was a product of his era, molded by conventional wisdom, the historical background of growing militarism, and the conviction that Japan is exceptional. A detailed picture emerges when his methods and motivations are examined. He was more than just a petty belligerent. He sincerely thought that the military could help to ensure Japan's survival. But even though his idea produced some initial benefits, it ultimately led the country down a destructive path. Strongly militaristic, Tojo believed that Japan needed resources as well as a sphere of influence in Asia. This combination of ambition, ideology, and perceived strategic need led to him playing a complex role in the attack on Pearl Harbor and Japan's subsequent entry into World War II. He saw the US and other Western nations as barriers to achieving this goal. The alleged threat of Western meddling and sanctions also fueled his urge for immediate action. As war minister, Tojo oversaw the preparations for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941 with the intention of weakening US Pacific forces and gaining time for Japanese expansion. He thought that if Japan won quickly, the US would be forced to engage in negotiations and allow Japan to rule Asia. Although the onslaught produced a tactical surprise at first, it ultimately turned out to be a strategic error. It unleashed America's immense industrial and military might and united the previously divided public opinion in the US, bringing them into the war. Tojo's risk proved costly. Drawing Japan into a war it was unable to win. Tojo was not Pearl Harbor's only architect. He rode the expansionist attitude wave by taking advantage of the tensions and fears that already existed. However, he was a major factor in forcing Japan to make this crucial choice because of his strategic thinking, leadership, and unwavering ambition. Recall that Tojo was a product of his period, molded by the customs of the samurai, the fears of the war, and a strong belief in Japan's future. It ignores the nuanced historical background and motivations that shaped his acts, reducing him to a simplistic monster. Japan's wartime Prime Minister Hideki Tojo is still associated with aggression and a botched war effort. But Japan had a spell of notable success in the Pacific theater prior to the tide turning, which left many wondering how such an apparently unstoppable force could finally falter. Analyzing these early successes reveals a nuanced combination of strategic forethought, ingenuity, and unanticipated Allied errors. Under Tojo's direction, years of careful planning paid off. Japan updated its armed forces, emphasizing amphibious landings, naval mobility, and air power. They carefully researched possible battlegrounds and refined their strategies, which included the critical component of surprise. Tojo's plan to strike Pearl Harbor shocked the world and provided the impetus for more victories. Motivated by the do-or-die tactic, Japan launched a swift onslaught throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Their coordinated air, naval and land assaults, along with their combined weapons tactics, overpowered Allied forces that were unprepared and frequently caught off guard. Important wins at Wake Island, Singapore and Guam demonstrated Japan's military might and made adversaries tremble. Japan made efficient use of the resources they had taken to further their advance. They showed a capacity to improvise and overcome logistical problems by setting up effective supply lines and tailoring their tactics to the local environment. In the early phases of the conflict, their emphasis on quickness and dexterity proved to be quite successful. Their early losses were partly caused by the Allied underestimation of Japanese capability and a lack of preparation. Early setbacks resulted from colonial complacency, antiquated strategies, and an incorrect estimation of Japan's power. The inability of the Allies to command and communicate together significantly hindered their defense attempts. Japan was successful in strengthening national cohesion and intimidating its adversaries through the use of propaganda and cultural narratives. The idea that the Japanese were a superior race that God had approved of encouraged their men to fight and demoralized some of their opponents. It's important to keep in mind that these achievements are fleeting. Japan's aggressive policies alienated local populations and increased resistance, while their expansion depleted their resources. Furthermore, it was disastrous to underestimate the strength and resiliency of U.S. industry. A pivotal event occurred in 1942 when the Japanese Navy suffered severe losses at the Battle of Midway, which changed the course of the war. A more nuanced understanding of the complex dynamics at play during this pivotal period of World War II can be gained by looking at these successes beyond the Banzai warlord stereotype. It emphasizes the value of readiness, adaptability, and knowing one's enemy, while also acknowledging the role of unanticipated events and human error in determining the course of history. The Imperial Army's seemingly unstoppable juggernaut left the Allies reeling as Japan's initial blitzkrieg surged across the Pacific. Knowing how they reacted, changed course, and eventually turned the war around tells a tale of tenacity, tactical turns, and the appearance of significant turning moments. The Allies encountered many difficulties in the beginning. Pearl Harbor and the fall of Singapore were examples of setbacks brought about by obsolete tactics, a lack of unity in leadership, and an underestimation of Japanese capabilities. But these failures also heralded a time of quick learning and adjustment. The US's overwhelming industrial might and the scientific breakthroughs of the Allies turned out to be pivotal. The mobilization of resources and labor, which produced ships, aircraft, and weaponry at an incredible rate, dwarfed Japan's capacity. Radar technology and code-breaking methods like Enigma decoding both offered significant advantages. Understanding that attacking mainland Japan directly would be expensive, the Allies devised an island-hopping plan, eluding strong defenses and seizing strategically significant islands to sever supply routes and tighten the noose around Japan. This change, which was the result of people like General Douglas MacArthur, worked incredibly well. There were multiple crucial turning points in the battle that signaled the change in momentum. The Guadalcanal War, in spite of its cruelty, proved Allied commitment and the limitations of Japanese resources, while the Battle of Midway in 1942 dealt a fatal blow to the Japanese Navy. It is important to keep in mind that the Pacific War was not fought in a vacuum. Resources and men were freed up to concentrate on Japan as a result of the simultaneous war in Europe, especially after Nazi Germany was defeated in 1945. Even though it was divisive at the time, the strategic choice to put Germany first ultimately helped the Allies win. A great sacrifice was made along the way to achieve triumph. On all sides, millions of lives were lost, both civilian and military. Because of the atrocities done and the need to stop further aggression, it was decided to demand unconditional surrender from Japan. This choice ultimately resulted in the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which brought in a new age of atomic warfare and raised difficult moral issues. The war's turning points and the Allied response did not follow a straight line of wins and losses. It involved a complicated interaction between industrial might, technological breakthroughs, strategic changes, and human sacrifice. A more comprehensive understanding of how the Allies ultimately succeeded can be obtained by considering these elements in conjunction with the larger global context of the battle. It's critical to keep in mind that both sides were made up of people who had to make decisions in the face of uncertainty and unfathomable circumstances, not just monolithic corporations. A more comprehensive understanding of this crucial historical era benefits from an appreciation of the complexity and motivations of all parties involved. The great sorrow and suffering caused during World War II, especially in the Pacific theater, are integrally linked to Hideki Tojo's legacy. To comprehend the gloom that loomed over this historical period, it is imperative to examine the war crimes and atrocities carried out by Japan under his leadership. A militaristic mindset that dehumanized the enemy and normalized violence was the driving force behind Japan's expansionist objectives from the beginning. This mindset, which was deeply ingrained in the military and fostered by propaganda during the war, served as the basis for a number of crimes. Japan has committed a long and extremely troubling list of war crimes. A horrifying example is the Nanjing Massacre, in which thousands of Chinese civilians were killed in a planned manner. In addition, Japan's occupation of other territories was marked by rampant sexual violence, forced labor, and prisoner murders. The extent of suffering went beyond overt acts of brutality during a war. Southeast Asian civilian populations suffered greatly from famine, sickness, and other hardships as a result of Japan's resource exploitation and forced labor. Even though numerous atrocities were committed by individual soldiers, the systematic character of these crimes points to leadership involvement. As both the War Minister and Prime Minister, Tojo is largely to blame for encouraging an atmosphere of impunity and neglecting to stop or punish these crimes. The Tokyo trials attempted to hold Japanese leaders responsible for war crimes after the war. In 1948, Tojo was one of the people found guilty and given a hanging death sentence. Even though the trials provided a measure of symbolic justice, the pain they caused could not be undone. Recognizing the past, teaching the next generation, and working toward a future devoid of such horrors are the real measures of accountability. Understanding war crimes requires moving beyond binary descriptions of good and evil. Individual decisions, societal norms, and historical background all influence the behavior of both perpetrators and victims. It's critical to keep in mind that war crimes affect people on an individual, community, and national level. They are not abstract concepts. Reconciliation and the averting of atrocities in the future depend on respecting the memory of the victims and learning from their experiences. Even though the legacy of war crimes is long-lasting, peace and respect for human dignity in the future depend on us addressing the past. By studying these troubling periods in history, we can grow from our mistakes and strive toward a day where justice and compassion rule the day. Japan's wartime Prime Minister Hideki Tojo continues to be associated with aggressiveness and imperial aspirations, but the horrifying war crimes and atrocities carried out under his direction severely damage his legacy. In order to fully understand Tojo's role in these acts of violence, it is important to look beyond easy classifications and investigate the intricate historical background, his own motivations, and the structural elements that made such widespread suffering possible. There was more than just Tojo to blame for Japan's wartime crimes. He came out of and actively participated in a profoundly embedded militaristic culture that dehumanized the opponent, exalted sacrifice, and accepted the use of violence as a justifiable means of conquest. His samurai upbringing and military career ingrained this mentality in him, which fostered his unyielding confidence in Japan's superiority and the need for harsh measures to attain its aims. Before taking office as Prime Minister, Tojo contributed to the conditions that led to more crimes. His participation in the 1931 Manchurian incident, in which Japan invaded and conquered northeastern China, was a pivotal event. Although he did not take the lead in the horrors that transpired, he was a major proponent of the repression of opposition and the justification of military action, which helped to create a climate in which violence was accepted. Tojo presided over an era of massive war crimes throughout Asia while serving as both Prime Minister and War Minister from 1941 until 1944. A horrifying example is the 1937 Nanjing massacre, in which thousands of Chinese citizens were killed in a planned manner. Comparably, the systematic cruelty carried out under his direction is best illustrated by the Bataan Death March, in which hundreds of American and Filipino POWs were made to endure a torturous march that resulted in several fatalities. There was more to the pain than just overt aggression. Southeast Asian civilian people suffered greatly from widespread famine, sickness, and extreme hardship as a result of Japan's resource exploitation and forced labor. A term for forced prostitution, comfort ladies, brought attention to the systematic suffering and dehumanization of weaker populations. It's still unclear to what degree Tojo knew about or actively ordered these atrocities. Although not every incident has been directly attributed to him, his influence and his constant advocacy for rapid growth fostered a climate in which these kinds of behaviors were accepted, if not actively promoted. His emphasis on military prowess and steadfast allegiance to the emperor further suppressed accountability and dissent within the armed forces, creating an environment of impunity. The Tokyo trials attempted to hold Japanese officials responsible for their acts after the war. In 1948, Tojo and other senior officers were found guilty and given hanging death sentences. Even if justice were done, Japan's military and leadership still bear a collective amount of remorse and responsibility for the horrors they committed. It goes beyond blaming Tojo for war crimes to investigate his culpability. It compels us to address difficult issues like cultural norms, systematic racism, and the risks associated with unbridled nationalism and militarism. To stop crimes like this in the future, it is essential to understand the intricate historical background, personal decisions, and social forces that contributed to these disasters. Even if the horrors carried out under Tojo's direction have permanently tarnished his name, it is imperative that we remember and comprehend this troubling period in history. Building a more peaceful and just future requires paying tribute to the victims' memories, admitting the pain caused, and warning future generations about the perils of bigotry and unrestrained hostility. Japan's leadership in the Second World War underwent a sea change in 1944 when Hideki Tojo resigned due to mounting losses, most notably the devastating setback at Midway and growing popular unrest. Due to his rigid strategies and running out of supplies, he was also under pressure from within the military to resign. General Kuniaki Koiso, his successor, proposed a different approach to leadership. Though he remained devoted to the war effort, he was perceived as more practical and moderate. He made an effort to investigate peace talks and strengthen ties with the Soviet Union, but these attempts ultimately failed. But Koiso's time in office was brief. He resigned in 1945 as the situation grew worse, opening the door for Suzuki Kantaro to lead the eventual capitulation. The cost of continuing Japan's resistance became more evident as the tide of World War II shifted against the country. Japan was on the verge of defeat as a result of its devastating defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, as well as continuous bombing operations and the impending prospect of a Soviet invasion. Emperor Hirohito stepped in after realizing the damage done to his people and the pointlessness of continuing the fight. On August 15, 1945, he declared Japan's surrender in a historic radio address, marking the end of World War II. He cited the unendurable consequences of continuing the war and the desire to open the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come. This left a legacy of immense human cost and permanently altered the global political landscape. Though joyous, Japan's surrender also marked the beginning of a time for occupation, rebuilding and introspection as it dealt with the fallout from its conduct during the war. Tojo's influence on Japan's wartime strategies was extensive and varied, leaving a bleak mark on the country's past. His impact as Prime Minister and War Minister may be broadly summed up in three areas. Tojo was a strong supporter of imperial expansion, driven by a combination of nationalism, militarism, and the conviction that Japan was better. He put into effect measures like land reforms to quell unrest in the countryside and increase military output, all with the intention of stoking Japan's belligerent aspirations. This played a part in the cruel enslavement of Southeast Asia, the invasion of Manchuria, and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Tojo increased his hold on authority, putting an end to opposition and requiring total subservience from the armed forces and administration. His do-or-die approach, which ignored the human cost in favor of offensive methods, resulted in tragedies like the Nanjing Massacre and the Bataan Death March. Although it increased productivity, this brutal strategy hindered creativity and flexibility, which proved harmful in the end. By emphasizing air power, naval mobility, and amphibious landings, Tojo modernized the armed forces. Although his early successes showed this power, his later setbacks were a result of his rigid strategies and stretched resources. He also encouraged a culture of blind allegiance and contempt for the adversary, which fueled war crimes and undermined international backing. Under Tojo's command, warfare was fought with aggression and brutality, causing great suffering and ultimately playing a role in Japan's defeat. It is nonetheless important to recall the human cost and ethical ramifications of his policies, even as we acknowledge his contribution to fortifying the military. Hideki Tojo's legacy is still hotly debated and continually re-evaluated in contemporary Japan. Here's a look at the intricate and often changing stories. Tojo is seen by some as a powerful leader who personified the spirit and military might of Japan, especially among far-right nationalists. They portray him as a victim of victor's justice, downplaying or justifying war atrocities. This narrative frequently exacerbates hostilities with neighboring countries who suffered from Japan's aggression during the war. A growing number of people are critically re-evaluating Tojo's legacy in light of war crimes and the human costs associated with them. They draw attention to the great suffering caused by his involvement in crimes like the Nanjing Massacre and his steadfast pursuit of expansionism. This viewpoint aims to accept Japan's culpability and make peace with the past. With less baggage from the war, younger generations frequently have more nuanced opinions. They accept the intricacies of history, appreciating both Tojo's military prowess and his atrocities. This makes room for analyzing the past critically without elevating or condemning it. Officially, the Japanese government regrets and admits war crimes, but controversial visits by government representatives to the Yasukuni Shrine, a place of veneration for both war dead and war criminals, highlight the continuous challenge of making peace with the past. For the next generation to comprehend Tojo's legacy with greater objectivity, it is still imperative that they be educated about the reality of war and war crimes. Reconciliation is facilitated, and historical revisionism is avoided through free and open public discourse that recognizes historical realities as well as divergent viewpoints. Political considerations, shifting societal ideals, and historical understanding all play a role in the ongoing process of re-evaluating Tojo's legacy in Japan. It captures the country's difficult relationship with its history of conflict, as well as its ongoing attempts to face up to its past and forge a peaceful future. The leadership of Hideki Tojo had a lasting impact on Japan, profoundly and frequently incongruously influencing its course. His military enthusiasm and expansionist aspirations during the conflict led him to make decisions that permanently altered the nation's image abroad. His legacy is an intricate fabric of growth and disaster on the inside. Tojo's centralized command and mobilization efforts helped Japan achieve its early military victories, which also contributed to the nation's sense of pride. But his brutal do-or-die approach came at a tremendous human cost, causing trauma and sorrow that would last for generations. Japan was obliged to examine its conduct during the war and adopt a pacifist constitution as a result of the occupation and subsequent defeat, which also made the country more open to international collaboration. Tojo's legacy is still contentious from the outside. While some of Japan's neighbors support its post-war peace efforts, others are still healing from earlier aggression. Visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors war criminals, rekindle debates and emphasize the importance of ongoing discussion and historical understanding. In the end, Tojo's influence is greater than a label. He was a product of his day, representing the sinister possibilities of unbridled militarism and nationalism. However, his leadership also unintentionally started the country's post-war transition to become a peaceful and successful one. Navigating these intricacies, recognizing the pain inflicted as well as the lessons learned, and making sure that the promise of a peaceful future is never overshadowed by the shadow of the past, are all necessary to comprehend his legacy.